Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Melissa V. Harris Perry's Sister Citizen, Shame, Stereotypes and Black Women in America. We are on the last section of this chapter entitled Angry Black Women. We're going to try to wrap this chapter up in this episode. On June 18, 2008, Fox News contributor Cal Thomas discussed Democratic presidential candidate Barack Obama's wife, Michelle. Seeking to place her within a larger tradition of angry black women political figures, he said, quote, "Look at the image of angry black women on television. Politically, you have Maxine Waters of California, liberal Democrat. She's always angry every time she gets on television. Cynthia McKinney, former congresswoman from Georgia, another angry black woman. And who are the black women you see on the local news at night in cities all over the country? They're usually angry about something. They've had a son who has been shot in a drive-by shooting. They are angry at Bush. So you don't really have a profile of non-angry black women except Oprah Winfrey." End quote. Thomas's observations evoke a third powerful stereotype of black women, one that characterizes them as shrill, loud, argumentative, irrationally angry, and verbally abusive. His statement shows the power of stereotypes to shape public perceptions. In his eyes, black women normally appear in public space, quote, angry about something, end quote. His first example, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, has been a member of the House of Representatives for more than 2 decades. She is a senior member of the Congressional Black Caucus and can claim notable legislative achievements affecting urban areas, education, and economic development. She was an early and staunch critic of the war in Iraq. She led a congressional investigation of covert American government involvement in the urban drug trade. Yet the expectation of black women's angry public posture negates the substance of her anger. She is just angry about, quote, something, end quote. Thomas also seems incapable of distinguishing among different black women. He mentions Waters in the same breath as twice-defeated former Representative Cynthia McKinney. Both of these elected representatives are equated with women who are the subjects of evening news stories about urban violence. Thomas seems unaware that the black women viewers most often encounter on their nightly news are, in fact, the local anchors and reporters at network affiliates across the country. These poised professionals are invisible in Thomas's analysis. The angry black woman myth renders sisters both invisible and mute. It is emblematic of the misrecognition of African American women. Observers like Thomas cannot see black women unless they conform to this narrow conception of black womanhood, and they cannot hear the substantive political claims these women make. The academic literature on stereotyping traces the popular representation of black women as uniquely and irrationally angry, obnoxious, and controlling to the 1930s Amos and Andy radio show. The nagging, assertive sapphire character on Amos and Andy gave rise to an oft-repeated trope in popular culture representations of black women, from Aunt Esther on Sanford and Son to Pam on Martin. The brash, independent, hostile black woman rarely shows vulnerability or empathy. The myth of black women's emasculating anger has not been studied in as much detail as the Jezebel and Mammy images. But the extant literature does suggest that while sapphire is one name for the myth, the angry black woman has many different shadings and representations. The bad black woman, the black, quote, bitch, end quote, and the emasculating matriarch. The relative scholarly invisibility of the angry black woman myth does not mean that it is inconsequential. Quite the opposite is suggested by black feminist scholars Marcelina Morgan and Dion Bennett, who write, quote, "The stereotype of the angry, mean black woman goes unnamed not because it is insignificant, but because it is considered an essential characteristic of black femininity, regardless of the other stereotypical roles a black woman may be accused of occupying. These stereotypes are more than representations. They are representations that shape realities," end quote. In other words, it is not studied because many researchers accept the stereotype. What is the reality that the angry black woman myth shapes? The respondents in my Chicago focus group of black women under 35 discussed how others saw them. Their self-descriptions were like those of the women in New York: kind, giving, and tender. But when they reflected on how their friends and family thought about them, a very different picture emerged. One person said sassy, mouthy attitude. Another person said aggressive, go-getter, and a self-starter. Another woman said strong, nice, juicy, smart, spoiled, outgoing, friendly. Another woman said crazy, friendly, self-motivated, hardworking. Another woman said crazy, reliable, friendly, conceited, loud, strong, spoiled, moody. Another woman said fun, smart ass, picky, humorous, bossy, and always having a million things to do. Another woman said stubborn, analytic, outgoing, supportive, brutally honest. These young sisters believe that others see them as considerably harsher, sassier, and more aggressive than they see themselves. Women in the Oakland, California, and New York groups showed the same pattern of assessing themselves as gentle, thoughtful, and kind, while believing that others more frequently considered them aggressive and brash. It is emotionally taxing to have to manage this disconnect between self and others' perception. There are also political consequences. Sharice Jones and Kumia Shorter Gooden used data from hundreds of survey responses and dozens of interviews to document Black women's painful experience of, quote, shifting, end quote, in their personal lives in order to reject perceptions that they are too aggressive or overly ambitious. Quote, our research reveals that many Black women feel pressure to calibrate their directness and assertiveness and minimize their accomplishments and success to make the men in their lives comfortable with and confident in their manhood, end quote. Although sisters may try to modulate their assertiveness at home, they also reported in my focus groups that their friends and family saw them as harsh and independent. Even as they try to manage their images, they feel haunted by negative expectations. We saw in the previous section that one member of my New York group described herself quite differently from how the other women described themselves. Deborah proclaimed, quote, I am loud, pushy, controlling, standoffish, and I am a loner. And that is how other people see me too, end quote. It seems Deborah has reconciled herself to the expectation of aggression by embracing it as her central identity. She feels upright in the tilted room because she is tilted at the same angle. Maybe this means that she feels no need to, quote, shift, end quote, because her self-perception matches how she believes others see her. In the group, Deborah did have a commanding presence, attempted to dominate the discussion, and constantly talked during quiet writing tasks. She had an easy laugh and plenty of opinions. She played the independent, opinionated, domineering Black woman perfectly, but the performance was too seamless to be convincing. Deborah never indicated doubt or vulnerability, attributes regularly expressed by the other participants. She may not have been shifting, but I am convinced that her tilted posture was a distortion of her full self. Okay. Let's take a second to reflect here. And I think that the angry Black woman stereotype is one that is very prevalent in our society. I think it's one that you see played out on TV screens a lot. You see it played out in on movie screens a lot. You hear propagandized in the news a lot. You even hear it from people within the community as well, within the Black community, speaking about women that they believe to be too headstrong or emasculating or not submissive enough and things of those nature. And I think that one of the things that Angela Davis did a great job of getting across to me was how the expectations for Black women historically in this country have always been different from those of white women. When white women were not being asked to work, Black women were only treated as laborers, as slaves. They were only viewed for the work that they could do. When white women were viewed to need the assistance of men or viewed to be not able to do the same type of task as men or do tasks at the same rate as men, Black women were being asked to and told to bring in the same amount of cotton as the man that was across from her. And when you look at how this country has historically attacked black men systematically and imprisoned black men and terrorized black communities and pulled black men out of households, you understand why there's been a need for black women to be able to have the capacity and capability to be strong in situations and to be able to carry a heavier burden than they should have to in certain situations. And I think a lot of times that can be viewed by somebody who doesn't understand it as being angry or being bitter or being emasculating. And a lot of times when you don't understand why somebody has a certain strength, when you don't understand why somebody has a certain characteristic, you can misinterpret the reason that they have it, and you can misinterpret the meaning of that characteristic. And so I think that one of the taking the time to learn about specifically what it is that black women have historically went through in this country, what it is that black women go through now in this country, puts you in a place where you have the information to debunk some of those myths. Let's see. The workplace is a particularly fraught terrain for black women who try to both earn professional respect and to guard against the expectation that they are irrationally angry. Ivy Kennelly's study of employers' stereotypes of black women reveals that white employers make a number of labor decisions based on their beliefs about black women and single mothers. These employers tend to see all of their black women workers through a single lens. They characterize them as single mothers, worry that their child care responsibilities will make them unreliable employees, and express concern about their, quote, aggression, end quote, and tendency to, quote, complain about everything, end quote. Black female workers appear to be conscious of these negative assumptions. A 1997 study by the Center for Women Policy Studies found that 42% of black women think it is important to mask issues of race at work. In another study, 56% of managerial black women indicated their awareness of stereotypes about black women in their companies. Alice, a 42-year-old woman in my focus group in Oakland, talked about the difficulty of being a black woman in corporate America. Quote, "You have to think about how to use the force of being a black woman. When I'm at work, and I work in corporate America, I'm not heard. It is because of my color and also because of my size. But sometimes I have to get heard. Then I go against some 50-year-old white male and I'm up in his face saying, 'You know what? You are wrong and this is what we need to do.' It is sad and you shouldn't have to do that." End quote. Alice senses that because she is an overweight black woman, her opinions are unimportant to her employer. But she also believes that she has a certain power to make herself heard in critical situations. Man, I lost my page. I done tweet. Okay. This force of black womanhood exists because she can become angry and loud, presumably intimidating the 50-year-old white men with whom she works. All right, brother, gotta get something to drink. Okay. In this sense, Alice's anger is a weapon of... Excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay. In this sense, Alice's anger is a weapon of the weak. Using this force does not necessarily make her feel empowered. Instead, she laments that she, quote, shouldn't have to do that, end quote. Alice's experience hints that the anger myth may be a double-edged sword. Sisters can sometimes get their way by confirming the expectation that they are threatening and angry, but doing so may leave them feeling that they have not truly been heard at all. Black women's personal and working lives are not the only places where they must manage a schism between self-perception as kind and good persons and outsiders' expectation that they are obnoxious and angry. Popular culture regularly propagates this myth. Oh man, this train going by. I hope that's not too Two nuts in the background. Omarosa, an early contestant on the popular reality television show The Apprentice, is the archetypal angry black woman. She shouts, lies, undermines other contestants, and earns everyone's contempt. Though just one of dozens of such representations on television, in movies, and throughout advertising, Omarosa is particularly insidious because The Apprentice is billed as reality. Her performance suggests that the sapphire myth is not just the construction of white fantasy. In clinical psychiatric settings, black women are diagnosed very differently from white counterparts who present with the same symptoms. For instance, black women have considerably higher rates of anxiety disorders than white women. Blacks are diagnosed with higher lifetime rates of simple phobia, social phobia, and agoraphobia. Therapists tend to view African American women as anxious or phobic while perceiving white women who describe similar emotions and behaviors as sad and depressed. Black women are more likely to be described by therapists as hostile and paranoid, and diagnosis for black women is inclined to be more severe than for white women. In these diagnostic differences, we see the operations of the social construction of black womanhood that disallows sadness. Therapists are less likely to perceive a black woman as sad. Instead, they see her as angry or anxious. Okay. So, upon reflection, I want to say that we passed a highlightable period there. Man, I was probably loud in the mic. I'm sorry. We still gotta get a new mic. We gonna get these things taken care of. I'm trying to get back into a more proactive mind state with at least the content portion of the organization and trying to get things right. So we gonna get a mic that ain't causing us to have extra feedback. But what I think is important to highlight, or is a highlightable piece in what we just read, is starting here with the statistics that we're given. In clinical psychiatric settings, black women are diagnosed very differently from white counterparts who present with the same symptoms. I think that part of truly struggling against these issues is being informed about all the different ways that these issues manifest, that these issues specifically here of racial injustice manifest. And being a lot of times a good way to tell that story can be through statistics. A good way to tell that story can be through historical facts, can be through experiences that people have had. And so those statistics right there do a good job of telling the story. Let's keep going. Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 report, The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, is a reasonable place to investigate the policy implications of framing black women as uniquely aggressive. Moynihan's report designated black matriarchy as the principal cause of a cultural pathology that kept black people from achieving equality. Moynihan's research predated the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but instead of identifying the structural barriers facing African American communities, he reported on the assumed deviance of Negro families. This deviance was clear and obvious. He opened because black families were led by women who seemed to be their households' primary decision makers. Moynihan's conclusions granted two generations of conservative policymakers permission to imagine poor black women as domineering household managers whose unfeminine insistence on control both emasculated potential male partners and destroyed their children's future opportunities. The Moynihan Report encouraged the state not to assist black mothers as women during their best in tough circumstances, but instead to blame them as unrelenting cheats who unfairly demanded assistance from the system. This practice of widespread cultural projection reveals what is so dangerous about the, quote, angry black woman, end quote, stereotype. It holds black women responsible for power they do not possess, power that is, in fact, being utilized in very real ways by members of other social groups who can claim emotional innocence as they hide behind and persecute the, quote, black bitches, end quote, of our cultural imaginations. That those last two sentences are another highlightable portion, another portion that should be highlighted. Because it speaks to the dangers of tribalism is when you allow yourselves to be as a community relegated to some sort of tribalism, you leave yourselves vulnerable to people who practice nationalism using tribes against each other or using deception amongst the tribes. And so by saying that, I say that, as us not being united as black men and black women, it allows for us to be vulnerable to subversive white supremacist tactics that pit us one against each other. And these specific stereotypes that are being brought out are important to combat and to break, because you can stereotype just the same way a stereotype is created. A stereotype can be broken. Stereotype is not something that is permanent. It's not instinctive. But you can't break a stereotype without understanding the roots of it and the implications of it and who benefits from the perpetuation of the stereotype. Because that is another thing that's at the helm of some of the things we're speaking about, is that there are political ties and connections to these stereotypes. All right. So where it says, this practice of widespread cultural projection reveals what is so dangerous about the angry black woman stereotype. It holds black women responsible for power they do not possess, power that is, in fact, being utilized in very real ways by members of other social groups who can claim emotional innocence as they hide behind and persecute the, quote, black bitches of our cultural imagination. Okay, here. I'm finna switch hands with the mic. I hope that don't cause too much of a... Okay, yeah, I did it smoother that time. All right, let's keep reading. The Moynihan Report did not create the angry black woman stereotype. It tapped into an existing framework and gave it a new, politically consequential name, the matriarch. Even as it undergirded the conservative social policy agendas of the Reagan Revolution and the Clinton moderation, the Moynihan Report also prompted decades of research, launching first a broad, social problems approach that assumed the existence of black matriarchy and sought to delineate its negative effects, and then a flurry of oppositional research by progressive social scientists and humanists who sought to discredit the reporter's findings by rendering alternative perspectives on black family life. It's a long sentence. Perhaps no response was more controversial than Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, which provoked substantial backlash because Wallace pointed out that black nationalist political movements propagated an equally vicious view of black women as emasculating and aggressive. Wallace argued that black male political leaders were also invested in framing black women as unnaturally aggressive and independent. Doing so allowed African American political organizations, led by black men, to ignore feminist challenges to their political agendas and to suppress black women's ambitions for political leadership. Black nationalist organizations nurtured oppositional racial politics while maintaining gendered inequality. Even as black men rallied against the emasculating findings of the Moynihan Report, they colluded with its assertion that black families and communities can be healthy and strong only when black women assume a subordinate role and allow black men to lead. Ella Baker was relegated to the position of secretary by Martin Luther King Jr. Stokely Carmichael told the women of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that their position in the movement was, quote, prone, end quote. In the Black Panther Party, sisters had to struggle to stay at the decision-making table rather than the kitchen table. Louis Farrakhan encouraged African-American women to make sandwiches and send their men off to the Million Man March so that these men could atone and then return from the march ready to assume leadership of black homes and communities. And as black feminist author and filmmaker Toni Cade wrote in her groundbreaking text, The Black Woman, 1970, quote, when a few tough-minded, no-messing-around Politico sisters began pushing for the right to participate in policymaking, the right to help compose position papers for the emerging organization, the group leader would drop his voice into that mellow register specially reserved for the retarded, the incontent, the lunatic, and say something about the need to be feminine and supportive and blah, 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 end quote. I am concerned that in their efforts to evade the sapphire stereotype, black women may be discouraged from demanding equal consideration of their specific political needs within black political discourse. This stereotype does not acknowledge black women's anger as a legitimate reaction to unequal circumstances. It is seen as a pathological, irrational desire to control black men, families, and communities. It can be deployed against African American women who dare to question their circumstances, point out inequities, or ask for help. Both white policymakers and black patriarchs can dismiss gendered claims as the ranting of eye-rolling, neck-popping, quote, "oh no you didn't," end quote, angry women. Black women's concerns can be ignored and their voices silenced in the name of maintaining calm and rational conversation. Their anger is not experienced as a psychological reality, but is seen through an ideology that distorts black women's lived experiences. The angry black woman stereotype hamstrings sisters who find that they cannot forcefully and convincingly advocate their own interest in the public sphere, either in black political movements or in American policy environments, because their passion and commitment are misread as irrational. Okay, and then that brings us to the ending of that theme right there. And I think I'm gonna try to throw some new batteries in here. They may be starting to get low on me, but man. Okay, it was just because it was a car nearby that noise was happening. It was just a car. Okay, I was hearing the noise in the back, but we got about a page and a half left to finish reading in this chapter. And man, that was reading Melissa V. Harris Perry put together this coherent stream of thoughts and an understanding of how this stereotype of the angry black woman, which is known far and wide in this country, putting together the political connections that it has, putting together the given historical precedent for times where this stereotype was further perpetuated, giving examples of how it's something that is perpetuated outside the community and inside the community, which is something that I think I've spoke about a couple of times earlier as we've been going through here, of the fact that a lot of these stereotypes have been embedded into the culture of America, not even necessarily black culture, so much that they've also begun to be embedded inside of black culture, and that part of that comes with black culture integrating into what is mainstream American culture. And so the mainstream American culture had racist political reasons to view these black women and all of these different stereotypes that we've read about. And as black men and black people have become more part of the mainstream American culture, those stereotypes have infiltrated our community as well. And so, but my point is, seeing the way that she is articulating these things is very enlightening. These are a lot of things that, when I try to when I have conversations about these things, a lot of times when I read a book, what I see myself doing is adding, different pieces to the conversations that I can have with people, or adding different pieces to whether it's me writing something or me, doing a live and speaking to people, or even just doing a podcast or doing a different reading experience I have with the person. Is just that all of these we need to have all these different perspectives to gain understanding of collectivism. It's one thing to talk about collectivism. It's another thing to try to actively achieve it. And it doesn't mean necessarily that you always have a bunch of people involved in everything that you're doing. I think part of what collectivism can be is understanding the issues of people beyond yourself and struggling for those issues and not just necessarily the issues that are individually connected to you directly. Okay. Stereotypes and shame. Geraldine is a 55-year-old black woman living on the west side of Chicago. During the exercise in which focus group participants discussed myths and facts, she put down her pen and sighed, quote, "Other people misunderstand us. They judge us. They don't understand that we go through so many different issues and trials. They don't get what makes us up into being a complex creature. We're misunderstood," end quote. Jezebel, Mammy, and Sapphire are the angles in the crooked room where black women live. They do not reflect black women's lived experience. Instead, they limit African American women to prescribed roles that serve the interest of others. It is hard being misunderstood. Misrecognition subverts the possibility of equal democratic participation. It is physically painful to hold an image of yourself while knowing that others hold a different, more negative image of you. At the turn of the 20th century, W.B. Du Bois named his painfully duality double consciousness. At the turn of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois named this painfully duality double consciousness. Quote, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity," end quote. Du Bois did not anticipate how black women's experiences would further complicate this duality, but he did capture the political relevance of this psychic experience. Lusty availability violates the expectations of the chaste Victorian era, but it serves the interests of slavery. Contempt independence challenges the ideal that adult women should rely on their husband's judgment, but it allows policymakers to define black families as deviant. Welfare dependence violates the ideal that Americans should be self-reliant, but it provides an easy scapegoat for national dilemmas. Mammy-like devotion to white domesticity reinforces safe norms, but it elicits pandering pity rather than egalitarian respect. Although none of these stereotypes capture the complexity of black women's lives, they have been powerfully and regularly reproduced in American political discourse and popular culture since the Civil War. These myths influence how black women see themselves and how they understand their struggle. Most important, these myths make black women feel ashamed, and shame has sweeping consequences for black women's lives and politics. Okay, and that brings us to the end of what I think was chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, which is entitled "Resisting the Shaming of Shug Avery." That was a very enlightening chapter. It was the first time I've seen some of these things. I feel like for the difference in, and I know I keep comparing this to Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class, and just for me, that's sort of how I compute things, is comparisons to books and similarities in books, and they're touching on similar subjects. Where Angela Davis read like a history book, this one reads like a philosophy book about some of those same issues, and takes pieces from those moments in history from Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, and expounds upon the ideology connected to those experiences and those events. Man, I don't mean to say but I'm just gathering my thoughts. That last section is definitely highlightable as well, where the contradictions are pointed out. I think I heard a Black Panther speech. Black Panther is a Fred Hampton speech, sorry. Brain freeze there. Fred Hampton speech where he said that one of the objectives of the Black Panther Party was to highlight the contradictions. And
the contradictions that were pointed out here, where it says contempt, hold on, lest the availability, that last paragraph, basically, that whole last paragraph that we just read, is something that I think is worth highlighting, because a lot of times that is the way to get people to understand initially the type of system that exists and why it exists, and to that's the, to begin questioning things, is to point out the hypocrisies, to highlight the hypocrisies. I'm trying to think of a word that starts with C that like me, that's a synonym for highlight that I can use for contradictions. I don't know, but I probably figure comment on the contradictions. I don't know, but we want to comment on the contradictions and highlight the hypocrisies that exist within this system, that exist within this society, that exist within this country, that exist within this world. Because it's at that point, that you understand that you can begin tracing back the roots. Like when you can see the hypocrisy that exists, like these hypocrisies that are pointed out here, you can look into those things that are involved in the hypocrisy and trace back to the roots and the origins of these issues that we are dealing with as a society. And so this is just a very good book on intersectionality and the uniqueness of the uniqueness of the struggle and the experience of Black women in this country. And so I want to encourage people to please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I know this was a little bit longer of an episode. I want to also thank people for listening to this episode, listening to previous episodes. If by the time you hear this, you haven't heard previous episodes, go back, listen to previous episodes, listen to future episodes. We put these out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin and further their journey in the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. I'll holler at you tomorrow.